Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Watchman's Whole Word Bible Study with me, Donovan, and we are in the book of Genesis. We just finished up chapters 14 and 15, where we saw God make a covenant with Abraham, but he didn't make the covenant with Abraham in his flesh. He made the covenant with Abraham while Abraham was asleep. And he sealed it himself. God himself sealed it without any input from man, from the flesh of man, from the pride of man, because everything that we do in the flesh, the scripture tells us and gives us plenty of examples of it, and our experiences, our own lives should advise us such that everything that we do in the flesh, it's corrupt, it's wrong, it's polluted, it's shaded toward evil. It's bent toward evil. That is the bent in our flesh. That is the bent of our nature. So God will excise that flesh as often as he can. And we're going to see how he gives Abram a symbol of just that excising. He gives him a physical symbol and tells him he has to keep it throughout all of his generations, all of his children. And to this very day, many of us keep it. So we're gonna see that. We also met Melchizedek, and we learned that is not a name. We aren't given his name. We're given his title, and that title is King of Righteousness. And he comes from a city. He rules a city called Salem, which, as far as antiquity knows, never actually existed. And Salem means peace. So the King of Righteousness reigns in the city of peace, and we meet him. He comes out at a time when the godless, pagan, heathen kings in the land of Canaan are warring with each other once again, butchering each other, looting one another, and that kind of thing. But strangely, the King of Salem, the King of Righteousness, he isn't mentioned as being a king who's fighting wars. His city isn't involved, and when he shows up to meet Abram after all the combat is over, he doesn't seem to have a royal entourage with him. It seems like he shows up by himself. The King of Righteousness, Melchizedek, sounds very much to me like Jesus Christ. Now, and Paul seems to indicate that Melchizedek is Jesus Christ. But it doesn't say that specifically in the scripture. Some people have speculated that it's Shem or Nahor, one of Shem's descendants. I think my personal opinion is that Melchizedek is the Lord Jesus Christ, and that is why Abram pays tithes to him. And we also see how when we're walking through this world, we're living among heathens, we see how we get caught up. If sometimes we can't help it, just living here, you can't help it. We get caught up in their affairs. Abram ends up taking part in a war that he has really nothing to do with, but he's living in their land. So they nab his nephew Lot, and he feels obligated to go and get his nephew Lot and all of his possessions and free him from captivity. But the reason why Lot is in captivity is because he's living it up and partying like it's 1999 in Sodom. And we know what Sodom's about, and if we don't, we're going to find out here pretty soon in the scripture. But so you see how there are all these things that they do in their flesh. Every time Abram is in his flesh, things go south for him. Every single time. He does things that, and then God has to bring him back and correct him. And that's kind of God's way. With non-believers, God doesn't often correct them. He just judges them. And sometimes that judgment takes a very, very long time, so long that it seems like they're not being judged at all. And we see that here with all the people in the land. There are, in the land of Canaan, for 400 years, more than 400 years, they are doing things like engaged in adulterous marriage affairs. They're fornicating. They're drunkards. They are taking men's wives by force. They're killing they're fighting in wars. They're killing innocent people. They are doing things like sacrificing their children to their gods that they've made up and made with their own hands. What they do is they make a god out of metal, or make a god out of stone, and then they light a fire underneath the god, and they heat it up till it's red hot. And the god is shaped so its arms are out like this to receive offerings. And they heat up the god until it's red hot. And then they take their infant children, or maybe not their infant children, they take their children and they put the child alive on the outstretched arms of an idol that they built, and they cook the child alive as a sacrifice. So all the people who talk about how God had it's a cruel God who would say butcher all of them, the men, the women, the child, and even the cattle, they don't ever consider what these people were doing. Now, another thing that they don't consider, they were also doing things like, as a fertility rite, they would take their newborns, strangle them, put them in a clay jar, and bury them in the walls of their house or under the floor, and is a blessing to the house. Just all sort, and they made all these things up. It started with Nimrod trying to build a tower so that he could worship the stars, and then they gave up on that. Now that was too hard, That continued. We still worship the stars today. I know Christians who run around. Are you a Gemini, or are you a Leo? Every time, as soon as you say something about your birthday, somebody's going to say something about the zodiac. It's a heathen ritual that is so ingrained in this culture that even the Christians don't even see it as idolatry at this point. But we see how these people are living. And one thing that the critics of the Old Testament God, who's supposed to be so much different than Jesus in the New Testament, the critics, they always neglect the victims. For 4 centuries, strangers, children, women, they waited. And how many of them do you think asked, where is God? Where is God? When my husband comes in here and snatches my 7-year-old child out of bed and says that he has to be sacrificed the next day because the crops didn't go well last year, and he doesn't want that to happen again, so he's going to sacrifice our child on this altar to this God. How many men came in looking to trade, looking for food, and ended up being butchered and had their wives and their children sold into slavery? How many? How many infants were suffocated at birth and put in clay jars? I mean, when we're weighing things in the balance, people are saying Canaanites are good and God is evil for destroying the Canaanites. But they're not considering that all the good people in the world who are saying things like that, they're not considering all the millions and millions of victims of the Canaanites over a more than 400 year period. And that doesn't even count Egypt. Slavery probably started with Nimrod, but Egypt perfected it. So all the people who are upset about slavery, well, Egypt pretty much, they didn't invent it, but they certainly rewrote the book on it. And they still exist to this very day, and there's still a place where you might be sitting in a church and get blown to hell. So there you go, all the critics who think that they're better than God, all the self-righteous people. So we see this here in Genesis, and God makes a covenant with Abram. He says, I'm going to force all these heathens out. I'm going to bring in my own people, because through them, salvation can come. Not because of them, not because they deserve it, not because they're good, not because they're righteous. Most of them aren't righteous. Most of them are idolaters. We're going to see in Exodus how the Israelites who came out of Egypt, they worshiped the Egyptian gods. And when they couldn't worship the Egyptian gods, they started making gods of their own. And when that didn't work out for them, they started worshiping the gods of the Canaanites who were in the land before them. And they did that over and over and over again. So it's not because they were good or they deserved anything. It's because of God's plan. And by God's mercy and God's grace that Egypt was brought into the land. But mostly it was so that people like me and people like you could be saved. And so we're going to see that. But Abram has this great covenant, and it's not done in his flesh. It's not even done really with his participation other than his willingness to believe God. And now we're going to see how he gets this great blessing from God. Nobody is around to see it. It's just him and God. So he goes back out into the world, and all the people who weren't there to see it, who weren't part of the conversation, they start talking to him, and especially his wife Sarai. And they talk him and he starts to believe. As time goes on, he loses faith. Slowly but surely, he loses his faith, and he starts to do things in his flesh. He wants to do those things. And we've seen this before. As soon as Noah got off the ark, his flesh told him, hey, you should get drunk. You know what you need? You need to just unwind with some wine. And that's what he did. He made some wine, and he got snookered, and he fell right into sin, right after God had saved all of mankind through him. And this is the human condition. As soon as we part ourselves from God, as soon as we let our wives part us from God, our children, our situation, our jobs, our joblessness, a drug, a drink, an attitude, as soon as we start letting these things part us from God, Satan gets right in, and he causes us to sin. He tries to make that separation permanent. And that's what he's going to do here with Abram. So let's take a look at it in Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. So let me pause right there. Abram shouldn't have been in Egypt. And one of the things that he brought out of Egypt was a servant. Many servants. Abram got kind of rich in Egypt, and one of the things that he brought out of Egypt was this Egyptian woman. The Egyptians are all pagans. They don't believe in God. And she is steeped in Egyptian paganism. And now here Hagar is living with God's chosen patriarch, Abram, and his wife. So here we already have a problem. And this never would have happened if Abram wouldn't have, of his own volition and his own will, gone to Egypt. Hagar wouldn't be here. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So she blames God that she can't have children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. So I have a couple of suspicions here. One of my suspicions is we're going to find out that Abraham is in his 80s at this point, and Sarah is 10 years his junior. So she's in her 70s. So these are not young people, and I suspect that they're kind of over each other. It doesn't seem like they have this real kind of lovey-dovey type of I can't live without you relationship. It's kind of a marriage that's practical, and remember, they are siblings, so they've known each other literally their whole lives. So they probably never were it was probably always a practical arrangement for them to be married. And it was probably arranged by their father, Terah. So I believe that Abram here has been eyeing Hagar. He has this young, she's probably only in her 20s or 30s. And he has this young girl in his house. And she's his wife's maid, so she's always around, and he sees her all the time, and I think he's given her the eye. And I think that Sarah has taken note of that Abram has a thing for Hagar. So she makes this offer, and he knows that everyone knows. Moses wrote this, and he knows what God thinks about righteous people intermingling in marriage and sexually with wicked people, because that was one of the judgments that brought about the flood. He also knows what God thinks about plural marriage, because he knows the story of Cain's descendant Lamech, who was both a bigamist and a murderer. But none of that matters to Abram in his flesh. He has this old wife. She's beautiful, sure, but he's been with her for her whole life, 70 years, and he's older, and now his wife, who he's been with all these years and hasn't given him any children, he's looking at her, and she's offering him to have a sexual relationship with a much younger woman. And he lives in a land where this is common. And so instead of taking what he knows to be right, his flesh jumps up and he likes this offer. He likes this offer. And he's like, well, it's a no-lose. How can I lose? I get to have this awesome affair with this young girl, and my wife is giving me permission. I mean, I would be a fool not to, right? That's what he's thinking. That's what his flesh is telling him. I would be some kind of punk to say no. I would be a punk, right? And his wife is going to tell him that he's a punk if he says no. You don't want to have kids? What kind of man are you? Not to, here's this young hot girl. You don't want to, what you can't do it. You can't get it. You can't do it right. You ain't right. What's wrong with you right now, right? That's the kind of attitude that she's going to have, because that's the kind of woman Sarah is, and we get a couple glimpses of that. And so here she is. She's doing something in her flesh, and she's going to lead her husband to do something in his flesh. Both of them completely out of the will of God. Now, Sarai does not know about the conversation that Abram had with God. And Abram willfully ignores that conversation at this point. He ignores the blessing. He ignores meeting Melchizedek. He just ignores all these things. And he goes on with his flesh. So, let's move on. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Of course. Of course he did. Because she was saying something that he already wanted to do. This is the real strength of Satan. Satan is not offering you something strange or something weird. Satan is offering you things that he knows that you likely already want. His job is so easy. He's putting in front of you things that you almost surely want. And here he's doing that through Sarai. He's offering Abram to take another woman who's much younger than his wife. And she's fertile. And he's ashamed that men in his household are having all these kids, and his wife doesn't give him, and he's going to use that shame to fall into sin, despite the fact that he's been promised that his wife is going to bring children into the world. He doesn't. That's not what he wants, and the waiting is killing him. If God had done it within a year, 2 years, 3 years, he would have made it. But it's been a decade. It's been a decade, and now he doesn't really believe God anymore. He doesn't. He thinks that he misheard. Now he's telling himself, yeah, maybe God didn't really say that. So they're thinking God needs some help. So after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. God hates plural marriage. In the beginning, there was one man and one woman. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, and it goes south right here, she looked with contempt on Sarai, her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, now look, now the woman who orchestrated this whole thing at Satan's behest, she turns. This sounds familiar. Go back to Adam and Eve. As soon as the sin happens, as soon as they bring evil into their household, they turn on each other. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. Well, she doesn't know what she's asking. This is her fault. Instead of telling her husband, stop looking at that girl, instead of getting rid of the girl, she took what she saw in her husband's eye, and she thought that she could manipulate the situation and she could play God. She thought that she could play God. She wanted to know the difference between good and evil. And here she is, just like Eve. Now that she's got it, now she's finding out that she doesn't want it. You don't really actually want to know evil, do you? But and now she wants to blame her husband, just like Adam and Eve did. They immediately turned on each other as soon as the sin happened, and it didn't go their way. There was no fruit in it. They wanted to pass the buck. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. So you see, Abram, you kind of read these stories and some of the things that happen. It's like, why does God like this guy? I can't figure out why God. In one of the ones we're going to read about Jacob, I can't figure out why God likes Jacob. Jacob is a really terrible human being. Like even by the measure of other terrible human beings that we like to do. But here you see Abram. First, he almost gets his wife made into a prostitute in Egypt. Now he sleeps with her servant, gets her pregnant. So he cheats on his wife. Yeah, he goes has an affair. They're in this gross kind of sexual thing that they're doing here, and pretending that it's okay. And now his wife is upset, so he now he has this pregnant girlfriend, and he looks at his wife and says, "Well, kick her out. Do with her whatever you want to. I'm done with her. I'm done. You know, I'm done. I had the young girl, and I'm good now. So do to her as you please." And so now they're kind of multiplying each other's sin. They're playing off each other, right? Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled. Now God's got to come in and salvage the situation. Sometimes I have a hard time believing in the direct intervention of the Lord because things that I go through and things that I see and things that I see other people go through, and I'm like, when is God going to step in and do something? And I don't mean for that to be blasphemous. It's just an honest confession, I guess. But here the Lord sees what's going on between Abram and Sarai, what they're doing to Hagar. She's pregnant, and he knows that if they continue, they're going to destroy they're going to do what Satan wants and undo the work of God, which of course we can never do. All we can do is make him come in and make a bunch of judgments and correct the situation, and that's what he's going to do here. The angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to shore. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" So here's the Lord with these questions, right? He's not asking for his sake. He already knows. He's asking for her sake. She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, so this is the comfort of Jesus. This is the comfort of the Old Testament God. "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against his kinsmen." So, this is Ishmael. This is a son of Abraham that God never meant to come into the world. And the descendants of Ishmael are what we know today is the Arab nations. They'll tell you that we're like Muhammad and all the Arab Muslims. They're all direct descendants of Ishmael and his children. And look how it's gone. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. I believe Ishmael was a good kid who Abraham loved quite a bit, but his descendants are exactly wild donkeys of man, and their hands are against everyone. So this prophecy has been fulfilled, right? It's fulfilled almost daily right before our very eyes. ISIS, Ishmaelites. Al-Qaeda, Ishmaelites. Bin Laden, Ishmaelite. Right? All of these are Ishmaelites. And they hate the children of Israel, and the children of Israel hate them. And this is all because of Sarai and Abraham and their sin, their sexual sin, for sex. They did this for sex. No, Abraham didn't do it for the kid. You see, when she conceived, he didn't want the kid. He was like, get rid of her. If abortion would have been available, they would have had an abortion. That's what they would have done. He didn't want the kid. He used that as a way to pretend that his sin was noble. Sound familiar? Which one of us doesn't do that? He wanted to feel like he was the righteous chosen man of God, and he was doing God a favor by sinning and bringing Ishmael into the world. He didn't want the kid. And I think that later he learned to love Ishmael, but when Hagar was pregnant with him, he didn't care what happened to those two. And Sarai, she didn't care. She didn't care. As soon as Hagar was pregnant, she hated her. And she never does like Ishmael. She hates Ishmael his whole life. Doesn't like him at all. And because it's a reminder to her. And we're going to see that pretty soon. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Leha Rod, and it lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So you can see he's a pretty old guy. And that goes back to what I had said earlier in this chapter, where in Hagar's 10 years, his junior is Sarai is 10 years younger than Abraham, as we're going to see pretty soon. So these two are kind of over each other, and what 86-year-old man doesn't want to have an affair that his wife gives him permission with a woman who's less than half her age? So, it was just sexual. That's what it was. And what they did was really unfortunate. And we're going to see here now, God continues to work with Abram. But every time Abram goes into his flesh or listens to people who are in their flesh, the flesh hears first the voice of Satan. It does not hear the voice of God. The voice of God can't get to the flesh. The flesh hates God. It's in complete revolt against the voice of God. So everything that you do in your flesh it's corrupt. And if you don't know that, just watch it. Watch it as you go through life. Watch it as you go through life every day. Mark everything that you do in your flesh and see how it turns out. See how it has no God in it. It just doesn't. So, and that includes getting married in your flesh, all the people who you sleep with in your flesh, all the times that all your flesh, all the emotions that come out of your flesh, all the decisions that you make in your flesh, all of it. All the ways all the interactions that you have, all the advice that you give, all the votes that you cast in your flesh, all the political opinions that you do in your flesh, all of them, all your social media, all the people I know who are, all the Christians I know who are on social media, go out there and look. Don't listen to me. You're going to say, well, that's your group of people. They're, your weirdo group of people. Take the people who you know in your life who are Christians, and it might take yourself if you're out there on social media, and see the kind of things that you're posting. Go see. Go look at all your opinions, and you tell me it's not all godless, worldly stuff about the meal that you ate and boasting about your children's accomplishments, boasting about your relationships, your cars, your vacations, all these acts of pride out there. Christians on social media act exactly like atheists on social media. On social media, you can't tell the difference between a pagan, a godless, heathen, atheist, and a Christian. Can't tell the difference. They behave, they act, they comport themselves in the exact same manner. And we see here, they don't have social media, but Abram, he lives among a pagan people, and he oftentimes comports himself exact. Can you tell the difference here between Abram and a Canaanite? Between Abram and an Egyptian? No. He's just like them. He's acting just like they are. So, and all they care about is the flesh. They don't know God at all. So, and he behaves just like them. So there's the warning. If you're hanging out, doing the things that pagans do, you're going to really do the things that pagans do, and they're going to be godless, because it's all going to be the flesh. It's all going to be the flesh. What you're doing is you're heeding the call of Satan instead of heeding the call of God. So, and that's a warning for all of us. I was on social media for years, and it turned out really, really, really badly. And God actually had to tell me directly to get off of it because of what I was doing on it. And everybody who I know who's out there on social media, including myself, I was like, well, I don't use it that way. I'm not. We're all different, right? All of us are different. I'm not the one out there. Yeah, you are. So that brings us to the end of this chapter, and we are not going to have time to hit chapter 17. So we'll hit chapter 17 and maybe chapter 18 in our next study. Until then, keep heeding the call and keep yourself in the love of Christ. Have a great day, folks.